prompting you and giving you those comments.
Cool.
But yeah, thank you very much. Simon, do you want to begin?
Great, fantastic. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the session on curating photo essays. Also, thank you to everyone who submitted. We put out a call for entries a few weeks ago, and we had some great content. The submission criteria was to share work that you've created around, a certain theme. So if you have a body of work you've worked on, maybe 40 to 60 images. Some had more, some had fewer. And I spent some time before this session. I reviewed through them. I've done an initial cull of all of the projects, so I'm only going to be covering 4 of them during this session. And I've also gone through those 4 and removed some of the ones which I think won't be productive either way. The purpose of this webinar is that I'll be talking through and assessing the worth of what images represent based on the intent that they are supposed to be part of a specific project, and then we can look at how we kind of curate that work down into a photo essay, which means that we'll be looking at what the intention of the finished essay will look like, what work contributes to that purpose, and then we can talk about any gaps that might need to be filled in by the photographer during future shoots, or that might be things to think about in as they go on with the project. So the way that a photo essay works for me, it's not a there's no like widely accepted definition people call any kind of series an essay, but for me a photo essay works a lot like a prose essay. And a lot of the ideas I talk about when I talk about essays in images is very similar to the way I write images, to the way I write essays now, to the way I wrote essays in university. And the way that I structure my thoughts for images is similar to the way I structure my thoughts in words. So I'll be looking at, out of this selection of, we've got 4 projects here, one's 39 images, one's 12, one's 38, one's 31, how we can take quite a large number of images and bring them down to the absolute basic essentials, which is maybe 5 to 10 images that really have the core of what the point is, what why this work exists, can be kind of summarized in very few images. When it comes to presenting a larger body of work, it can be as many images as possible, but the absolute outline has to have these key pieces. And then when you have those handful of images that are the structure and the framework, you can then add any other images on top, but they're not tying together the essay as much as those core images. A photo essay and a photo story, I have a difference. In my mind, they're 2 different things. A photo story to me is a sequence of events, so a beginning, middle, and end, which is very clearly structured. A photo story conveys more narrative, but the photo essay is about translating an idea, conveying a point. You have an intention. The way that, in an essay, you have an argument that you're trying to put forward about a certain topic. I don't think that they're always mutually exclusive. A photo story can be a photo essay. A photo essay can be a photo story. So when I'm talking about the work here, I'll be using the language of photo essay, but it might result in something that looks more closely like a photo story. The structure of an essay, the way I write them, usually has an introduction. So you introduce the audience to a concept, to an idea, then you put across your points, your argument, either with single images or with diptychs that kind of either challenge the idea you introduced in the introduction, or embellish it, or enhance it. And then you conclude, but that's different to a story ending, because a conclusion of an essay is more of a summary, more of a kind of release of the tension that you've built up in the argument, than something definitive as a piece of closure. There are 2 ideas I find helpful for both photo essays and photo stories. Firstly, I use cinema a lot. The structure of a scene in cinema usually works that you establish the scene, you've got a wide shot, then you've got a mid shot, then you've got a close shot. And that means you're going from a location to a situation to a person or to a detail. You know, you're kind of focusing in as you go closer. That's how cinema informs my understanding of story. And more for a photo essay, there's a great quote about writing. I can't remember who this quote is attributed to. I think it's Stephen King, but it's that every sentence you write either needs to introduce a character or further the plot, which means that every single photograph in a photo essay needs to either be, you know, introducing an idea, introducing a person, or taking that person, taking that idea to the next step. And if it doesn't do those things, then I would say it's non-essential. You know, if it's just aesthetic, if it's just there to look pretty, then it can be fine as an individual image, but it doesn't fulfill a function within the confines of a photo essay. So every image offering something, you know, builds up the core of this idea. Anything else, any other, you know, aesthetic image, peripheral images can support that idea, but they're not the essentials that we're going to be looking at today. You know, if the essential isn't there, then it's all just pretty pictures, which is fine, you know, for a gallery display, but it won't result in a photo essay. So we're going to look at 4 bodies of work that have been submitted. I'm going to reduce down to the essentials, and then I'm going to see what maybe might be missing. As I said, I'm going to be covering 4 of the projects we received. The work was provided with a short write-up, which I've got next to me on my iPad. So I'll be referring back to that as taking that as the artist's intention, and then through my curation, that'll be my interpretation of it. But it's not what I'm doing is not the most objective or perfect way to do things. This is just my way of doing things, and hopefully it will give you ideas of how you can do it yourselves. But if I'm doing something that maybe the artist disagrees with or would do differently, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to take what I'm doing here as the law. It's just my interpretation. The time I spent with the images already was in removing like severe outliers and trying to focus in on, you know, what the artist meant, what I could leave in to then discuss why I would be removing it later. So I'm going to be doing a lot of deleting images, but that doesn't mean that I'm saying that these images are bad or wrong or, you know, somehow incorrect. But for my interpretation of your intention, they're not needed for this to be a photo essay. You can include them later on, but for reducing down to the core elements, I'll be doing a lot of deleting, but don't take that personally, and don't see it as me criticizing those individual images. That's not what this is about. I'm going to be doing a slightly different structure to the way I normally do webinar tutorials, which is I would give an assignment and then take questions. At the moment, because this is just going to be me doing work and then, you know, having some give and take in the Q&A later, I want to cover 2 bodies of work up front and then take some Q&As. So if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. And then after 2 pieces of work, I'll go through those, answer some of those. And then moving forward, I'll maybe be able to even answer some of those questions through the next 2 projects that I cover. And then after I've covered all 4, I'll take a last set of Q&A questions. And that will be the structure of this. So the first project I want to look at is called Subway. This is by Miguel Melo, and he said it's an ongoing documentation of Lisbon's subway. This is the one I've got up here. Ongoing documentation projects are great. It's a really nice way that if you have a daily commute, or if you have an aspect of your life that you constantly revisit and it could constantly offer you new things in photographs, it's great to document that. But it's a very broad idea to talk about when you want to have a photo essay, because documentation over an amount of time, you know, if you're documenting a place, you might be documenting the gentrification of that place or the movements of people within that place. But documenting the place itself means that there are a few ideas that I would call essential. And I would say that the location is essential, so you have to establish the subway. So some of the images are going to have to do that. You have to establish the activity or the kind of mood or atmosphere you want to be documenting. So those 2 essentials are what I'm going to be looking at when I go through these images now. Once the location's established, we're happy with an image that does that. Everything that follows after that is the documentation. So I'm gonna just quickly look through now. I'm not very used to using Lightroom with an audience. I normally just kind of blaze through it. So I'll do my best to talk through what I'm seeing now. So the only thing I'm looking for right now in these images is whether or not they establish the location of a subway. So this one doesn't, this one doesn't, this one doesn't, this one doesn't. I'll just, Robin, what do you think the best way for me to, I'll just kind of flick through them.
Yeah, that works.
Great. So this one might do. This one has it's a good kind of introductory shot that pulls you in. So I'm gonna flag that one as a maybe as our introduction. For me personally, I don't enjoy hand holding with my projects. I know it can be very easy to say like, okay, so we need a shot of the subway from the outside, and then we come down the stairs, and then we do that. But no, it's not. A photo essay isn't like a guided tour around an idea. It's I like to have. I still like to give my audience some credit, so it doesn't need to give you everything on a plate. You know, it can still have a bit of ambiguity to it. But as long as we've established the location, that's what the first image is going to do. So I think out of the images I've selected, I would probably go with this one, just because it has, it has the train, it has the space. So this would be my first image, as it were. Let's see if I can move that to the top. Okay, so that would be one. Then the next image is going to have to pull us to the next step. So where are we going from this? We've established that this is the location we're going to be in. Then let's establish, I think this would be a good secondary image to establish. It brings us onto the train. It brings us onto that location. It's the next step. I think out of the submitted bodies of work, this one probably works nicely as a photo story as well as a photo essay. But I think in terms of, it's introduced us to this concept. It's introduced us to the setting. It then brings us into the next step of moving onto the train, and then we can have some of the images where it's where it's the actual life on the train. So we're off the platform now, so maybe this one, maybe this one, and then for a conclusion, for a look at the way that we've got this idea, we've been introduced to the setting, we've been introduced to some of the things happening in that setting. We need to now understand maybe the implications, or maybe the conclusion to the photographer's journey when he disembarks the train. Where does he go? And that would provide a neat kind of conclusion to these ideas. Or you can conclude with an image like this one, where it would be it's more of a detail shot. It doesn't tell us anything more about the location, but it just hones in on some of the people there. So it's difficult to use the bar at the top because I've also got the zoom window as well. So no, that's not what I was trying to do.
You're trying to filter those?
Yes.
You can do it near the bottom right hand side of your screen.
Aha, thank you. Wonderful. So this is then a more curated selection from the 39 down to these 9. And then I would remove, so these ones were supposed to be introductory shots. So I can unflag those. So I would say then that these ones are the most essential in terms of establishing the setting, bringing us on board, showing us some of the context, and then kind of leaving it a bit more open to the audience. So this is how I would present this body of work as a photo essay. Do you reckon that makes sense, Robin, or shall I move on to the next one, or has anyone taken massive issue so far in the Q&A?
Not so far.
That's good. It means they're saving it.
Yeah. I mean, as Simon says, please do, comment, write questions, anything that crops up along the way. And as Simon said, we'll come back to those questions in intervals.
So this is a body of work taken in New Orleans by David Babian. This one was a bit more open. it's a documentary of the street life there, and I think this one makes for a very simple photo story by the end of it in terms of documenting the nightlife, the engagement, of the streets, but also of something that came across in this music is the street music. So I'm going to be focusing in on the role of the music and that kind of nightlife, or day life in this image. But I think this is the only one. So I'm going to remove this one because it's a bit too grand. It's not as personal. I think that these two images are a nice diptych because it brings you outside to inside, even though it's not maybe the same place. But I always liked these two images together. But I'm not gonna use this one. This one I think is a nice introductory shots because you're immediately, you're on the streets, you're there, you're with these people. So that's going to be the first one. And then from here we're going to go. This is a nice establishing shot in general, but there's nothing really that follows through from this one, so I'm going to remove this one. The bands I think are all essential, so I'm going to leave those for now. The street one here, like it's a nice image, but it doesn't give us anything that the first image didn't, so I'm going to remove that one as well. This is a nice context shot, a nice character shot, but again, it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't challenge any of the ideas or introduce any of the ideas that we're talking about in terms of the musical nightlife. So I'm going to remove that one as well, and that leaves us with the bands and the motion of people. And I think that as in terms of raising those ideas, these ones do it quite effectively. I think I like this one because you've got the you've got the person on the table playing the violin or guitar. You've got the people engaging with this scene. Then you've got this part of the scene continued in these images. Not this one, sorry. And then this one, because it's the only daylight image, I think works as a neat bookend for this idea, because it brings you into the daylight, but it shows you that those the aspects of the idea to do with the nightlife are still prevalent in the day. So I think that would be the way that I would conclude this series, this photo essay. Cool. So that's the first two. I've done those quite quickly.
We've got a few questions in.
Wonderful. So yeah, if we cover those, and then I'll move on to the next ones,
Okay.
and then take a final Q&A session.
Yeah,
and there were also a couple of questions that I received from people via email, and I'll cover those in the final Q&A later.
Great, thank you. So a question from Brett: do you consider the length of the photo essay based on the theme before you edit the work?
So you'll always be curating towards an intention. So if you want to make a photo book or just a zine or just an Instagram slideshow, whatever it is, it's good to have that in mind, but it's the same as a written essay in that the length is long enough that you cover everything, but is not overly long that it gets tiresome or that you're hammering home the same points every time. I think if you make a point, you make it well. That takes one image. You don't need to have a series of images that all look the same unless that somehow contributes to your point. Once you have one solid image for each idea, then that could be, that's the shortest version. But then you can add 100 more filler images in between those images and turn it into a book. So it depends on what you're working towards.
I mean, kind of based on that question, a question from Ben: typically, how many photos constitute the core? Is there a max min that you work to?
No, the core can be one image, it can be 10 images. For me personally, I try and make it 3. I try and have a beginning, middle, and end, or an introduction, argument, and conclusion. But that's not something that you really know until you look at the work, because it'll be more decided on. It'll be more based around what the work is than around what you want it to be. There are a lot of people who, they want to set these little boxes and say, okay, it needs to be this number, and that was difficult for me to work into this webinar as a syllabus, because it's not something I want to be showing. But for educational purposes, I do need to restrict myself quite a bit. when you look at the work will tell you. You know, that sounds very arty and airy-fairy, and I hate it, but it's, you know, if an image needs to be there, it needs to be there. And if an image doesn't need to be there, you'll figure it out quite quickly, because you'll look at it and it'll either be much weaker or much stronger than the others. But you know, an entire lifetime's work can revolve around one single image. It doesn't need to be. You don't need to restrict it. But then if you look at your work and find out, okay, I've only got you know, I've only got 5 images, then maybe you need to go and make some more that fill in gaps. So far that hasn't been something I've discussed, but I think in the fourth body of work, I'll be talking about what's missing and what could be added, and that's where the core of the project is there, but there's not enough substance to keep someone interested in the idea that it's trying to convey. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. Nick, kind of on the terminology, remind you the difference between an essay and a story.
So again, this is just my personal definition from my understanding. An essay is about an idea, and a story is about a sequence. So a story, like in cinema, you'll be introduced to a character. That character will have a situation. That situation will have a resolution, hopefully. So a photo story brings you into a situation, introduces you to the people. You see the situation between those people play out, and then you have something that resolves the tension. So it'll be, you know, those people all smiling and happy at the end of it, or the consequences of that when you follow up 10 years later. Photo stories, you know, can go over a long amount of time and tell one story very intimately, or they can go along an individual's life and tell their story very well. Whereas a photo essay is more about an idea. So the idea of the idea of this one is that this is Miguel's experience on the subway. The idea of this one is that this is a documentation of nightlife in New Orleans. The idea behind this one, which we'll get to soon, is that it's the relationship that the changing of the 4 seasons have on people's mood and behavior, and this one revolves around documentary of again similar nightlife in London. So a photo story is similar to what we're looking at here, because we have these long form documentary projects, but the idea in that story is different to what the story might be telling if told long form. So a photo essay, when you have this idea, you can have an idea about exploring, you know, happiness, sadness, joy, a more abstract concept, or you can explore an idea about human behavior, or an idea about how animals interact, or any idea that you want to explore that isn't simply a sequence of events occurring in front of your camera. Because then once you have a large body of work, whether you even took that body of work with this theme or with this idea in mind, it can be turned into an essay about that topic. I hope that answers.
That's great, thank you. Anna asks, do you feel you should never mix black and white and color in a photo story / essay?
That's one of the questions that I was asked by email as well. Again, it depends on the story. There's this is something I've spoken a lot about before. There's black and white and color isn't just an aesthetic. It's not just something that you look at, but there's a function behind each of them. Color photography has a function. Black and white photography has a function. And if the individual images serve that function well, then for sure put them next to each other, and you know it's that image speaks for itself. But you won't just make images make sense next to each other by making them all black and white or making them all color. That's not that'll only make sense from an aesthetic point of view, which isn't. I don't think I think that's a more superficial point of view than making images conceptually similar or conceptually different and then presenting them that way. The color and black and white differences aren't enough that just changing one to the other will make something make more sense in sequence.
Great, thank you. Stephen says, is the procedure for a photo essay the same as a photo book?
It can be. I think the best photo essays are ones where, when you've got the core elements, the core components, you can make anything out of it. So if you've got these images, so for example, these images in New Orleans, you could take each of these ideas and add 10 more images that are similar or that say slightly different things or that contrast with these images and make it into a much longer project. The same here with these. I think we ended up with the flagged ones, which now aren't showing. I'm showing with the rest of them as well. But you add in more of the activity inside, more of the passengers, more interesting events, and you can add up and add up and add up until that becomes a photo book, until you have 100 or 500 images and make a whole compendium of this project. But it revolves around the core images, because without those core images, it would collapse. You would just have a sequence of things happening on the train. You wouldn't have been introduced to the environment. You wouldn't have the kind of roller coaster of the way that you're brought through these images wouldn't ever move up and down in a way that brings you to turning the next page. It would just kind of plateau. I think that's kind of not a criticism on the idea behind it, because I think it's a wonderful project. But Humans of New York, if you look at it as just a photo book, you turn the pages, there's no real reason to turn the page after you've seen the first 10, because it's just pictures of people. There's no establishing shot, activity shot. Maybe there are a few, but it's not designed that way. It's designed to give you an image, give you the text behind that image, and that gives you one idea very, very effectively and very, very consistently. And for some people, that'll be enough to keep them interested. But when we're talking about only photographs, in order to keep someone moving to the next thing, you have to bring them up. You have to treat your audience with respect, give them these ideas, and then leave them with something to think about.
Great, thank you. Pharrell says, did you see these photos prior to the session? Because it takes her hours to create her own work. Do you find it easier to kind of create other people's work?
So I did have a look through these images before the session, and I did a bit of early curation just to bring them down to something that would be easier to talk about within a short amount of time. I used to think it was much easier to curate other people's work because I'm more disconnected from it, and I think that sometimes you see more merit in other people's work than your own, often because you don't have the emotional connection to their work that they do, that you don't feel the same things. You're only looking at it objectively as an image. And I used to think it was difficult to curate my own work with the same ideas, but then I realized that it's maybe less important. It has less significance than we put on it to be very, very discretionary on the way we organize our own work. I try and apply as much of what I'm applying here to my own, but I also think that the harsher you are, it can be much better the more harsh you are with your own work, which means that when I'm harsh with other people's work, I'm not being more gentle on myself. I'm probably being harsher on myself. And because it's now so easy for me to just, ignore an image that maybe took me a few days to work on, to conceptualize, to photograph, or an image that I have a sentimental attachment to because of whatever situation, I can look at that image and go, nah, and just remove it from the current pool of images that I'm looking at. Because it's easier for me to do that, then it's much easier for me to be presented with a body of work and go, this is all rubbish, and my ego is not invested in your photographs, which is now the same as what I've managed to do with my own, as I don't care about any of the images, and the less I care, the easier it is for me to actually understand, this works, this doesn't work, why that is.
Great, thank you. Not a question, just quickly to answer Matthew's question, who can't actually see you but can only see me. Apologies for that.
Okay.
All you
That's
need to do, all you need to do is go to the actual little mini screen where you can see me currently, and just change the view from show active speaker video to show thumbnail video, and then you'll be able to see Simon, hopefully. So let's put that one.
As long as you can see the screen with the images I'm talking about, that's probably the most important aspect of this.
Question from Raphael. Does it require that for a topic or a subject in a photo essay, does it have to be in one place, even the time you took the photo, or should be the same? So yeah, does it
Um,
have to be in the same place at the same time?
so I'll just say this will be the last question I'll answer for this session. I'll then answer the rest at the
Yeah,
end. That's all right,
there's
but keep
plenty
me
more.
informed. It's great, perfect. Um, no, there's no limitation of any kind whatsoever. I would even say that I've seen some really fantastic photo essays which have been made by 10 different photographers in 10 different places at 10 different times, but the work's been presented together because it all relates to the same idea that's being discussed. So if 10 photographers over 100 years have photographed the same um, uh, like political movement or the same um, aspect of human emotion, if they've all covered that idea, then that work will all work as an essay. I think with a photo essay, it's the best thing is to remove yourself from the idea of even, let alone time and place, but even it just being you as the photographer, that you're contributing to a body of work which is larger than yourself. And I think that's very freeing because then, it opens you up to collaboration. It opens you up to seeing what your work actually does, what it says when presented with other people's work around the same idea. I think you can say a lot more as more people than just one person in one time and one place. Is that good?
That's great. Thank you.
Cool.
And just before
Well,
we go on, just another reminder, if you can please put your questions into the Q&A panel, it just makes it easier to keep track of. I'm just going to write down the few questions that I've seen crop up in the chat feed.
cool. Thank you.
Over to you.
Um, so this project is by Cecilia Ferraro. It's called Sunny Intervals. She had quite an interesting. This is an interesting project, I thought, because it ties quite nicely into what I think will work as a series of diptychs, which is something I'll be talking about in an upcoming webinar. So she says this project has a non-linear viewpoint and provides insight into the shifting nature of the seasons, the effect on the people's on places and people's moods, and that the images, are capturing these unpredictable emotions, and that they also capture the way that things change very quickly. My understanding of the absolute core intent of this project is that the is that it's a documentation of people's behavior and specifically the way that behavior mirrors in nature. So my minimum number of images for this, if I were to be producing it myself, would be 8, and it would be 8 images presented as 4 diptychs. A diptych is when you have 2 images that are presented next to each other as one concept. And each of these 8 images, you would have one for spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and each of those would be a context shot. So that would be an aspect of nature, a color, a mood, and then next to that, you would have the effect of that as you see it in people's behavior. So when I do a quick curation now, I'm going to be looking at where are my 4 seasonal shots, where are my 4 behavioral shots, and then I can put those 2 next to each other. And I think that the body of work, as I've kind of glanced through it already, is quite decent at. I think it has those things. I don't think anything's missing from those 4 ideas here. So we've got texture shot, person shot, atmosphere shot. These 2 images would probably be for the same season. So I'll go with this one. The thing about this is that for a photo story, this would be a very nice transition between this photograph presented first and this one where you've got them being discarded. But for a photo essay, you only need one of them, and because it's not about discarding aspects of the seasons, because it's about contrasting those seasons with people, we don't need this one. And I think that this comes back to what I was saying about being more objective as a curator, about how you can just delete something when you know it would work in another context. Well, if an image works in another context, use it in that context. But that, because we're not doing photo stories, we're doing photo essays, I'm more comfortable with removing something like that, something like this. I'm keeping the people shots just because I haven't had a good look through them to know which will work best alongside the different seasonal shots. So yeah, this will take a minute. Feel free to put on some music or something if this is too quiet. And of course, it's still very subjective. Like my associations with the seasons are probably very different to other people's. So when I'm removing an image that you might think is the most definitive spring photo you've ever seen, that's only because it's not for me, you know. So I would probably say that the easiest to do would be winter. So this would be winter, and probably alongside that one, I would present the photograph of the man at rest. I think they complement each other quite nicely in terms of the color tones, the mood, the kind of relaxed, reduced nature. After winter, we've got spring. I think for spring, I most associate the blossoms, so I would put that one there. And I think in terms of the behavioral shots for spring, there would be this kind of emergence of life, so I would use this one. I'll go through these properly in a larger setting in a minute. Spring, summer, winter, spring, and then summer. I would use the activity shot, and I would also try and find something with the most vibrancy, the most brightness. So it would be this one, and then autumn would be what I associate most with autumn is that kind of the darkening. So I would use this one for the context, and then for the behavior shot, or the human presence, I would use that one, which means that's our 8 images and presented. Robin, are there any tricks to presenting these 8 images in a way that are big next to each other?
Select all, Command A,
Mm-hmm.
and N.
Grand.
And if you Shift Tab, you'll get a bigger space.
Wonderful. So yeah, this would be my winter, spring, summer, autumn, and that would be my absolute essentials for this project. And then revolving around these, these 8 images, these 4 diptychs, however you would want to present them, you could have as many other images as you want, which bolster this core idea, this core concept. Each of these.
Can you just explain? Someone's asking what is a diptych?
So a diptych is when you present 2 photographs next to each other as if they're one image, as if they're one concept presented as a pairing. That can be done if you've got a photo book and you've got a double page spread, and on each of those pages is 2 different photographs, but they both say the same thing or they both complement each other in some way. That's a diptych. If you've got 3 images, that would be a triptych, and it goes onwards into a lexicon I don't really have, but there are different words for presenting different numbers of images with each other. And as I said, I'll be doing a webinar hopefully in June. What do you reckon, Robin? In June on
I think that's looking likely.
On presenting images specifically as a diptych, and also taking the images in the first place that will result in a diptych. So that would be this. That would be my understanding of this project. This project is by Andy Blowers. It's a year's worth of documentary photography coverage of a couple of places in Carnaby and Soho, Ain't Nothing But the Blues and Trisha's. Andy is a musician. He wants to document the people and places he frequently plays in and interacts with. His contention is that he has a feeling that places like this won't exist in their current state for much longer, and that there's a high turnover of people who go through these places, and that it's worth capturing that as it vanishes. So the core of this idea for me is that it's the pastime, the vanishing nature of that pastime, capturing those details that won't be around, and whether or not he achieves that is something that I think, but because it's only been a year's worth of coverage, I don't know that you can get all of that, but hopefully we'll be able to look at what he has produced and see what aspects can be focused on to make it a more complete project, because I think it's a nice body of work and it has some very nice ideas, but to present this as an idea that these spaces are vanishing, I don't know that the content of the images is there yet, because I think what you have is there's documentation of nightlife, but I don't think we've reached the point where you've got the people in a state of, of removal from that situation. I think for a photograph like this, I think it would be decent to have, either this image or a similar image as an introduction shot, because it introduces you to a location, to the setting that that Andy's most familiar with as a musician himself. This would be his stage, so it brings you to his stage. But also, because of the low shutter speed, you do have this sense of the people in motion, but also you can interpret it as the people vanishing. So I'm going to make this one first, because I think that brings you into the idea nicely. Okay. So then where do we go from this idea that we've got the situation, we've got the location? Where do we take this? I would say that the one of the most essential things for a project like this about vanishing spaces is the the things we kind of take for granted, that we don't really think about, the details that we find. So if we go through, we've got people at tables. There were a few images in here where it was moments like this where you've got the interaction. I think work quite nicely as a detail that it doesn't tell you about the place, but it tells you about the emotions of the people who are in that place. So I would say that this, I would call that essential. And then for the conclusion, for this kind of thing, you can end with like a hopeful message. You can end with a to show that things have vanished, but to produce that image, you have to wait another, a few years until the whole thing's boarded up and out of business and all of that. If that's the direction this project ends up going in, that's the photo that will conclude it nicely. But I think of the selection for a conclusion of the concept, I don't know that the image is in this selection. I also think that there are a lot of details, a lot of characters need to be balanced in this. You need to have a good ratio of things happening, but also details that you're going to miss. I think out of the images that I've got access to here, I would probably put this one as a conclusion, just because it's a bit optimistic. It shows that that the people are engaging with the location. It's a very direct action between the photographer and the audience. I think that's the photographer / musician and the audience. And I think that makes sense to present these three images. And from these three, you can build up the rest of the project and have the rest of them revolve around this. So hopefully that all makes sense. Those are the last of the images that I thought would make sense to cover for this kind of webinar. I'll now take all of the questions that are remaining.
We have plenty of questions.
Grand.
Okay.
I'm going to try and open the Q&A box as well myself, just so I have them open, because I know I can get I go off on tangents sometimes.
Well, I'll just cover off the ones that cropped up in the chat feed.
Cool.
Question from Brett: do you consider the length of the photo essay based on the theme before you curate, edit the work?
No. The length of the essay again will be about how much you've produced. Whether it's a complete body of work. If you curate and realize that you've got 50 images, but you're also lacking 70 images, you need to go and take those 70 images. The length will be more. There'll be more factors in deciding how long it's going to be than just your decisions, or than just what the work demands. There'll always be something. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, it does. Benjamin asks, would you say how you approach a photo essay story is like creating a storyline?
So for creating a photo story, that works as a storyline because you have a sequence of events that have to make sense within context of each other. The images in a photo essay don't necessarily need to work in context with each other, but they all contribute to the overarching idea that you're trying to prove. So you could have 10 photos that don't have any relation to each other as photos, as aesthetic pieces. But when you look at it all in the context of the theme that's being explored through those photographs, that's a photo essay. That's where it needs to make sense. The sequencing, like a timeline, makes sense if you want to show, a before and after of situations.
Great. And Nicole asks, would you say magazines and editorial design relies more on the format of photo essays or photo stories?
Um, if it's a magazine or an editorial, I think it's based more around photo essays. If it's um, if it's a piece of news coverage, then it'll often be more isolated. So when you look at news coverage, you're normally getting it in terms of one story at a time. But when you do big historical retrospectives of 50 years worth of coverage of a specific story, then you get more of a photo essay. It's quite close to being both, because obviously just because a story is being told through the images doesn't mean it's being presented that way. But when you have something like like World War II coverage historically, and you move through dates and times and battles and consequences and conflicts, that's a story. But if you have one idea, like the way that fashion changed during the time because of rationing, that would be a photo essay, because it would be presented in a more disparate set of images, but they all explore that same concept. I think, Robin, your recent documentary of the all dressed up and nowhere to go, that's a photo essay, because the photographs as a collection, they don't advance the plot, they don't take you to the next step. It's one idea explored very deeply through lots of different individual images.
Yeah,
If that's context that makes sense to anyone else who's seen that body of work.
it's a fantastic body of work.
It's Pulitzer incoming.
Steve asks, how would you create a photo essay that spans over multiple locations with aspects that aren't aesthetically similar, but the concept is?
um if the concept connects, then you don't need to worry about aesthetic, you don't need to worry about multiple locations. I think that those are things that you can think about. So if you decide to use one lens or one type of film to tell the story, that can help, but it's not essential. I think that if you decide on the idea first and then go out and shoot the project, it's a much easier thing to curate, because you've gone with the intention of that idea in mind. For what I've been doing at the moment, which is going through my archive and kind of just making little sets of images that have these thematic connections. They're a square format, there are panoramas, there are color, there are black and white, there are film, there are digital, there's all kinds of different images. But as soon as I put them into a little sequence, and you flick through them, and you kind of pick up on the themes, it almost doesn't matter what the images look like. If each image is a sentence, and a collection of images is a paragraph, then by the end of that paragraph, as long as you haven't just had the same sentence repeated to you over and over, as long as you have a clear understanding of what you've just been told, then the paragraph makes sense. I think that's a useful analogy, because I've said this whole thing is based on how I write my prose. And if I just if I could very easily in sentences talk about multiple locations, multiple aspects, and not use and do that in different languages, or do that with different code switching intent in each sentence. But read as a paragraph, if it makes sense, then for sure it's complete.
Thank you. Michael asks, how will you file the chosen photos for future reference?
For me personally, I don't normally. I just kind of make a note that these images make sense together, and then I can do with that as I wish. I keep all of my images stored using cloud storage when it's a scan, and obviously I've got all my negatives in folders physically. I don't do anything to change I don't do anything physically to change my negatives. Those are just sorted in chronological order of when I took them. But when I have the scans, I'll make a little note, and I'll just say this file name, this file name, and this file name makes sense. And then maybe 10 years from now, I'll be like, oh, and also this file name, and that finishes the essay. I'm not a very good kind of storage guru. I wouldn't know what kinds of systems or mechanisms for remembering different filing types would make sense for you, because they barely make sense to me.
Yeah, I'm pretty clueless on that as well. Question here, does the medium film or digital play any role in your decision?
No, at the moment I'm pretty much solely a film photographer. When it comes to curating a body of work, I'll curate film and digital together any day of the week. It doesn't affect the nature of the message. The medium isn't the message in photography a lot of the time. The medium is just the canvas. As long as the message is consistent, that's what goes towards my decision to curate together or disregard.
Great, thank you. Miguel asks, so sequencing is and should be considered almost as important as the quality of the individual photos in the essay. How does one balance, and just a kind of follow-up question, how does one balance the number ratio of establishing middle and bookend photos?
Can I have those as two separate questions again? Sorry.
Yeah, so sequencing is and should be considered almost as important as the quality of the individual photos in the essay.
Yes. So if I gave you the last photograph first, you would be moving it would change the nature of the story. If if in a sequence of images you're presented with an idea and you go, this is the idea that I want to tell you, and then you present them with the evidence. You go, this is the idea, and then you go, this is what the idea means to me, or this is what the idea could mean for other people. If you put those out of order, if you give me the idea without telling me what idea you're about to give me, I'll be reading too much into it myself. So the first image has to build up and establish this is the intent. This is the intent of what you're about to see, and then you receive that intent, and then you go, okay, well, this is maybe a bit more personal. This is what it means to me, or this is what it means to the people involved. It leads you out. But yeah, mixing that around changes the way the audience interprets the work, and changes the way the audience reads into the ideas that you're trying to distribute. Whereas for a photo story, if it's a sequence of images, beginning, middle, and end, you can play around with that a little bit more, because it's not about the idea of the images, it's about the process that those images are depicting. So you can be a little bit freer with the organization. But I think you have to be clear at some point that that's what you're doing when it comes to a photo story, especially when it's a journalistic one, where the sequence is very important to the truthfulness that people are taking away from that. And the second question was,
how do you balance the number ratio of establishing middle and bookend photos?
I don't think that it necessarily requires balance. I just think that it needs to be there. It needs to be there in the first place. If you have two images that say the same thing, you only need one. And once you have three images that say the three most important things, then you can include all the other images around that. But if you just have one image and then one idea around that, you haven't explained yourself very well. You've only explored one piece of the idea. So the balance, the ratio, the numbers, all of that is meaningless, because it can be done in just one image, or it can be done in 100 images. It massively depends on what the work is, how you've produced it, how long you've spent on it, what you actually have to show for that amount of time. And then you look at a series of work and you go, oh, this will work as a book, zine, gallery, display. But then you go a bit deeper and you realize, actually, I'm missing out this piece that fills in this gap, and without that piece, the rest of the body of work is meaningless. So the ratio is whatever ratio it needs to be.
Great, thank you. The question, you mentioned at the end of a photo essay story, you try and leave something for the viewer to think about. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
So depending on what the essay is. So do you mind if I use your All Dressed Up and Nowhere to Go project as an example for this? Because
go for it.
So as a photo essay, the project explores. It's a series of photographs which show people out on their front doors. They're wearing their Sunday best. They're dressed up, but the point of it is that in the context of the image, it's in we're in a state of lockdown, we're in a state of quarantine. So they're all dressed up with nowhere to go. That's the intent of the project is explained in the title. You know, if you just looked at the images out of that context, you would just have a series of images of, you know, portraits of people outside houses wearing suits. So to turn that into a more fulfilled essay, in that you introduce the idea. So first of all, you have to establish the idea of lockdown. You have to show, you know, either the people who are preparing to get dressed, or, you know, or diaries with months crossed out, or whatever it means to show that there's nothing to do. That establishes that idea photographically. Then when you conclude, you would have maybe another photograph of a calendar, and this time would have a few months in the future. And the implication of that photograph is these people are all dressed up. It's not for now, it's not for yesterday, but, you know, maybe this will all be over soon, hopefully. So that is a way to, and that's a very simplistic thing to do, because those are very kind of obvious photographs to take, to use an icon like a calendar which shows the passage of time. But it's been done before. You know, the Koudelka watch photograph, which shows anticipation as a single photograph. That doesn't really mean anything, but when you look at that in view of the wider body of work, when you look at that as an introductory shot to the country being invaded, it shows this countdown mentality. The role of that photograph changes based on the way it's presented with the rest of that work. So when I talk about leaving the viewer with something to think about, that maybe isn't even an image that you even intend to make, but it's the image that you look at and you think that in the context of the rest of the work, in the context of the ideas that are established, this is what I want someone to come away with. This is what I want people to think about, to leave people with, as a result of they've just explored this idea with me. Do I want them to take action? Do I want them to be complicit? Do I want them to buy something? Do I want them to go and see a movie? You know, any idea that you can give to someone, that's, I think, the function of the last image in a photo essay should be to take someone onto the next step. Maybe that image thematically leads on to the next photo essay you've done, and it pulls you through a sequence like that. There are so many different things you can open yourself up to, but I think that a photo story, where it has a beginning, middle, and end, the end is important because it's the conclusion. It shows the end of a photo story is less of a summary and more of a, this is definitively the close of the book. Whereas the end of a photo essay can introduce even more ideas or more things to think about, or can summarize things in a way that reframes them in a new way. You know, there are lots of possibilities.
Great, thank you. Fiona asks, can you expand on your explanation of the different functions of color versus black and white, following on from the question as to whether they might be mixed within a story or essay?
Yep. So it's established that if the function of a I think it's a Winogrand quote, if the function of a photograph is to describe, so the function of a color photograph describes color, the function of a black and white photograph describes black and white. It doesn't describe color. Even though that, like if I take a photograph in black and white of a beautiful field with a clear sky, you kind of understand that the grass is green and the sky is blue, but you don't need that to be described to you because it's obvious. In my photography, when I photograph in black and white, it's because if I were to describe that situation to someone, if I take a photograph and it's, you know, two lovers kissing in a park, I've just said it, I've just described it. You probably have an image in your mind of what that could look like, and I don't need to tell you that the grass in the park is green or what the people look like, but it's just that idea. And as long as my photographs convey the idea, they don't need to be in color or black and white. They could be sentences. The reason to use photography is because that gives me a very fast way to react to things that I'm looking for. So when I then react to those things that I'm looking for and then use the photograph to describe those things, whether I'm describing the color or not, whether I'm describing the event or not, is where the function of color or black and white comes in for me. If I'm describing the aesthetic of something, if I'm describing, I saw a beautiful sunset and the sky was this shade of pastel orange, and you know the boats on the horizon were these dark silhouettes, that would probably necessitate color. But if I just say, oh, it was great, I saw this guy and he was picking up loads of heavy boxes and they all fell over. You don't need to know all the colors of that. It's about the situation. So that is the function of black and white or color for me. And I don't know that answered, because I forgot what the question was. It was just to expand on it. I've expanded on it.
I think you've expanded well. Yeah,
those are the worst questions, because it's just like I'll just talk forever.
Elisa asks, is it technically good? Yeah. Like, do your pictures have to be kind of technically perfect, or can you also include the imperfect but like meaningful images in a photo essay too?
Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect image. I would refute anyone who claims that any of their photographs are an exercise in getting the most out of every single one of their pixels or pieces of grain. That's not a real thing. There's no definitively sharp or in focus or or low grain. Those aren't things. Those are only things if someone's trying to sell you a camera. No offense to Leica, who have generously put on these webinars. In fact, I would argue that Leica is one of the most interesting. If you look at a body of Leica photographs, you'll see some of the grainiest, most out of focus, most shutter blurred images made out of some really great pieces of kit. It's never about what you've gone to for technical perfection. As long as the image is the image, you can't add it's not a criticism to say this image is so good if only it were a little bit sharper, because then you're talking about a different image. The images you have, whatever they are, whatever they say, as long as they say that thing, that's what matters. If they need to say it by being out of focus, by being unsharp, or if those aspects aren't important to what that image is saying, then who cares?
Right. John, just going back to the diptych, are diptychs kind of considered as one image?
I would say that it's presented as one idea. I think that an image, I do a lot of reductionism with my approach to ideas, and I try and bring things down to their basic image. If I have to say, oh, one image means one box and everything is in that box, well, that takes away from the role of, maybe if you've got a 3D image and you've drawn with 2 lines and they go around, and you look at that image with glasses, is that 2 images? Is that 1 image? I think that if you spend too long thinking about those kinds of questions, where it could be anything, if I say that one image is actually a collection of 24 million pixels, so it's 24 million images, a mosaic of tiny pieces, you get lost. You lose yourself to that kind of thinking. I think that one diptych of 2 images next to each other, of 2 photographs next to each other, can make 1 image, as in the image itself is enhanced by the nature of it being 2 photographs. Because then you've got things like, what if you're using a half frame camera like an Olympus pen, and you take 2 frames and you scan that 1 frame and it's 2 photographs, but they're on 1 frame of film, and it's too much. For the intent of actually being able to go and do the thing, to make a diptych, you take 2 photographs, you put them next to each other, and you present those 2 photographs as one, and that's a diptych to me.
Great, thank you. How do you think you can put together a photo essay without a strong personal bias or an aim to be objective while still visually flowing?
The role of bias is very interesting, because I don't even by having this conversation in English, that's a bias towards a certain audience, that's a bias towards a certain way of thinking. I think that this idea of bias is a much bigger one than photography. I think that the idea of having an unbiased approach to anything is fundamentally flawed, just by nature of, I am biased towards most of the time towards being alive, towards eating good food, towards interacting with interesting people. Those are all biases, in that I lean towards them over other options of, eating bad foods, interacting with unpleasant people. Putting together any amount of work, any amount of artistry, is about showing that artist's bias. It's about putting across, why am I looking at these images from you? what is your leaning that other artists aren't showing me? This doesn't just apply to photography. This is this is all art, this is all literature. Why am I reading this book? What aspects of the world am I going to take away from this book? Because if we didn't have bias, leanings, opinions, every photograph would be the same, and then every photo essay would say the same thing. So looking to remove the role of bias doesn't have a place if the intention is just to show images in a certain way. I think that being maybe clear, being more open about yourself as an artist by doing by producing work where it shows that you've put thought into what you're doing, then it can explain, maybe it can explain or contextualize some of those biases, but you'll never remove them entirely. So knowing that a body of work was created by a person, by a certain type of person, in a certain place, and that he had read these political manifestos beforehand, and that he voted this way, and then I look at their work, I can read into all of those things, and I can understand those biases. Can you remind me of the question again, just so I'm staying on track?
Yeah. How do you think you can put together a photo essay without a strong personal bias or an aim to be objective while still visually flowing?
Yeah, aiming to be objective, aiming to be unbiased is admirable, but I don't think that it comes across when it's just about presenting images. I'm not saying that it's impossible to make an unbiased photo essay, but I'm saying it's very, very difficult, because in order to be an unbiased photo essay, what that will essentially require is for it to be one essay about all things that have ever been photographed, and it's a collection of all human history presented in a way that you can absorb it and feel that you have experienced a subjective viewpoint from each person who ever had a camera. I think that will be the only unbiased photo essay, and even that will have its own bias because it was taken on this planet. I think the difficulty, I think a lot of people want to restrict themselves because there are some very prevalent ideas in journalism that opinion pieces have become much larger than they used to be, and that you can now read about anyone's opinion and take it as if it's being told to you as the objective truth. But I don't think that just because photographs are a more clear, or often a more clear representation of reality, doesn't mean that they show objective truth. So the only way that you'll be able to do that is by being an honest person. So presenting a series of images, answering any and all questions that are put to you about those images in an honest way, to support your work is probably the best way I could recommend going about producing something, as unbiased and objective as possible. I'm sure a lot of you will probably disagree with that, but that's how I would try and do it.
Right, thank you. Where was it? Teresa says, should a curated collection be peer reviewed or viewed by an independent person, as an independent from the photographer and curator, to make sure that the core idea concept is there?
I think it's an incredibly useful and incredibly underdone thing these days, because I think people post a lot of work online and assume that anyone who comments or leaves a like counts as a peer. Whereas for me, when I have my work reviewed by peers, they are people who I trust, have photographed with, understand their biases, understand their perspectives. Sometimes I have a completely different understanding of their perspectives than I thought I did, and that will show when I say, what do you think of this work? And they will also have an understanding of what I'm doing. If someone is your peer, they are on the same level in that they're following a similar path, or they're following a completely different path, but in a similar way. But just sharing work online is meaningless. Don't take likes as meaning that people actually like your work. I think there are some fantastic photographers who offer critique portfolio reviews, ways that you can share work in a similar way that I've done here, but instead of doing the work for you, they look at the finished work and tell you whether or not it makes sense to them. And while that can be useful, it's not always, because if you really decide that you're an auteur, that you have produced this work and that it's your statement and no one else is ever going to get it, then you present it to people and they say, I don't understand it. That's fine. You solidly are behind your work, then, you know, go ahead with it. But it's always important to take people's criticisms from that point of, okay, well, I've just shown my food photography portfolio to a wedding photographer, so of course they're going to say that I didn't capture the, you know, the bride the right angle because there's no bride in my work. Critique is always going to come from a place of, you know, from what their work is like. But if you find someone whose work you respect, who's who seems to have gone along a similar path to you, whose body of work, you know, you're not trying to duplicate their body of work, but you have respect for what they've achieved, they're achieving something in a similar field that you're working towards, that will be the most useful person to criticize your work. Or just bring it to me and I'll tear it down, whatever it is, as my peers have discovered.
Well, actually, that kind of leads nicely onto the next question. Gareth says, in all your presentations today, as in all the portfolios that you've critiqued, they've resulted in a very small number of images. Mm-hmm. You always look to distill down to the bare minimum.
Absolutely. In even there's so much photography. There's too much. There's no way that anyone will be able to present. Like if you just printed off your Instagram profile as a book and it's got 2,000 images, it's not one I would ever pick up and think about because it's just too much. The iconic photographs are one image that tell a story. But we're not going for iconography in a photo essay. We're looking at how to translate an image properly. And I base that off of the way I write essays, which means that it has an introduction, an argument, and a conclusion. But for me, if I in my entire career can make one or two images that leave me, then I'll say that I've done, you know, more than most, because even in that bare minimum, what that minimum represents is actually quite a lot. So I think even in these photographs, I'm not distilling them. Three images is just a quantity. It doesn't, you know, three can be a large number or a small number, whatever it is. But when you look at what each of those three images brings to the essay, it could be a complete essay, or it could be a framework for a more complete essay when you introduce more images that support your argument. So it's not about just going, this is too much work, I need to only have a few images. It's about what is the function that each of these images fulfills? Is that even a function that I think is necessary for what I'm trying to do? And then meeting that criteria, not exceeding it, not what's it when you don't exceed something? Failing to meet? Not failing to meet it, but meeting that criteria. Sorry.
Great, thank you. Molly is asking, is there a difference in this process if you want to include written captions with your images?
The role of captions is almost its own thing. Depending on what the caption does, yes. If you start with the images and just present the images, which has been my focus for this presentation, then yes, I would say that they're a different process. The process for images with captions is, what function does the caption provide? So if the caption just tells you what's going on in the photograph, and it's a journalistic photograph where names, dates, and events are important, then for sure add those captions as context. If the caption gives something of yourself as an artist, if it says, you know, I felt this way when I took this image, or this image makes me feel a certain way, then it contributes and it becomes part of the photograph. Then that can enhance your understanding of why I'm looking at an image in a certain place, or what an image actually is contributing. But I think that it reduces the power of those individual images to do what those individual images are going to do. If you've decided that these images are going to do a thing, but then you augment that with a caption, then you're saying that the image isn't strong enough. And often that's the case. Like it's very, very difficult to produce an image which does it all. So when you involve a caption, you have to understand what function that's going to do, whether that's going to change the meaning of the photograph, you know, what influence that's going to have. And then when you've got all of your images down, when you've got all of your captions down, just have a re-review of both, you know, independently. Have a look at just the captions, have a look at just the images, and then have a look at both and see if things need to be shifted around or removed.
Great, thank you. Just actually a comment on one of the edits that you did. Brett was just curious into what you were thinking about putting the person in bed together with the cherry tree for spring in the third project.
Let's have a look at that. How do I get back there? This one. Repeat the question.
So those the second set, the two images together, the cherry blossom and the person in bed. What were your thoughts behind putting those two images together?
So the concept for that one is spring, which is I associate blossoms with spring because they emerge, and the person is kind of emerging from a slumber. It wasn't very deep. There was no, it wasn't like a philosophical it mean like, no, it's just all of the essays that I've produced for this webinar have been to illustrate the points I'm making in the webinar. They're not objective. So as long as what you're taking away are the ideas that you can apply to your own bodies of work, then I've done my job. But if you're taking away that these are exactly how these images need to be presented, then you haven't done your job as a student.
Couple of questions that you can answer in one. Talking about kind of horizontal, vertical, landscape, portrait images.
Sure.
Where's the other one? Oh, here we go. So when you're actually making the images, are you thinking about the purpose of where they're going to be used later on, in terms of whether it's on the website or in a print magazine? Are you making the decisions when actually capturing the images?
So sometimes yes, sometimes no. For when it's just me photographing for me, then whatever the aesthetic demands of the photograph are at the time, I make the photograph that needs to fit into my frame. If I'm photographing for a client, so this happens a lot with when I shoot advertising and commercial work, there's a requirement that if you're photographing, let's say, a model in a studio, you need to sometimes have a space here because there's going to be text here, there's going to be text here, maybe a logo is going to go somewhere. You need to be aware that those are requirements that either it'll be given to you in the creative brief, or a graphic designer will shout at you afterwards because you didn't include them. So it's always best to have a good understanding with what the requirements will be, and then to photograph in that format as is necessary.
And I mean, I think the screen that's shown on the computer right now is answering it, but can we mix horizontal and vertical images?
Yeah, do whatever you want. Mix square format, mix panoramas. It can be interesting to see them presented in print, because the nature of a print is that if you have these images and they're all the same format, they're the same size, then in print it doesn't matter. But if you've got a book where the pages are a certain size, then you'll be limited to horizontal, landscape, or square, which means that there's more or less negative space in different areas. And I think it's better to just focus on what the images are saying and just present them clearly, rather than worrying about what the negative space will look like. Because if you're too worried about that, then hire a better graphic designer to make them flow. As long as the two images are next to each other and associated for a sequence, that's the main thing, not what shape they are. That's putting too much stress on yourself. Shoot the images that need to be shot. Don't worry about, because if each individual image speaks for itself, you won't need to worry about what it's standing next to, because you get to the next one and that's also speaking for itself.
Great, thank you. Is there an ideal number of photos in a photo book?
No, as many as it needs to be. If it's the same photograph 100 times, then I don't know that that's what a book is for. I think that my association with books is that you're moving through a process of something, whether that's having an idea explained to you, having a situation explained to you, having a location shared with you, or having a story told. As long as you can get through each of the images and receive something new from each one, which I guess leans towards as few images as possible while still being as many images as necessary. Whereas if you go overboard and have too many images that are necessary, it doesn't need to book. Just sell those as prints, sell those as whatever they need to be, present them in a different way. But a book, as long as it's as much as it needs to be, basically, which I know is a kind of cop-out answer, but I'm not just going to say like a page number, because that's not a real answer.
Great, thank you. Do you have any tips to disconnect from our images?
I kind of do, but it would err towards the side of being disconnected from a lot of things, not just the images. If you really think you're too attached to your images, then just have someone else look at them. It's not I don't think that it's a skill that to maybe encourage, because as an artist you should be attached to every single one of your images, because those are, you've made those, you've created these things, and then to have to tear them down yourself can be very, very discouraging, whereas to receive that criticism from someone else is better. So the absolute easiest way to be disconnected is just to have someone who genuinely is disconnected look at them. If you truly want to look at your images from new eyes, you have to reduce them down to what they're made of. So the first thing to do, quite a simple one, is just turn everything upside down in your Lightroom magazine or in your little prints, whatever they are. Look at them upside down first and go, okay, what shapes are these? What do the images look like? Because just because we look at photographs the right way up as intended by the artist doesn't mean anything, because they're three-dimensional objects or two-dimensional objects that can be looked at objectively in any form. So by removing the context of what the image is and reducing it to a sequence of shapes, by turning it upside down, by looking at it freely, you'll realize, oh, actually, that line is doing something completely unexpected, or that triangle shouldn't be there, or that circle ruins it. And so you've turned it into something new, you've looked at it as something new, and then you can remove it based on that. If you then turn it back and go, but actually, yeah, I actually love this image because of this, keep it, it's a great image. But by adding those filters, so for example, I also take my glasses off and look at them as blurred, because then you're just looking at the essence of the composition, and you can see that things are overlapping or doing odd things they shouldn't be, and that way you've just looked at them as compositions and understood what works and what doesn't there. And you can apply that kind of thought to to any level of the photograph, whether it's visual or conceptual. So you can give your work to someone else and say, okay, describe these images, describe what you see to me. And if they look at the image and describe something completely different than what you photographed, then okay, well, maybe the intent isn't clear, maybe the image isn't clear. But that's not them telling you about the image, but it's giving you a perspective that allows you to understand how other people are perceiving that image, and then gives you an informed understanding of whether or not that image works. But I wouldn't encourage actively seeking to become disconnected from your work. I think that can be a difficult path.
Great, thank you. Where was it? Rushkin asks, in the context of a photo book, what role does the cover image have, and should I avoid repeating it in the sequence?
The cover image makes you buy the book. It's I know there's a very don't judge a book by its cover, but when it's a photo book about photos, it's always a very interesting thing to see the cover of a book that has been designed in a way that is very clear that the person has tried not to give anything away about the book. They want to leave it a bit mysterious, but why would you want to do that? Like, sure, you can if you're an artist, but if you're a photographer with an intent, and the intent is to do a certain thing with the book, then the front cover of that book should be a good explanation of that. Or if you take the front cover of the book and it's got a title, and you use the title as a caption, then the two things could maybe complement each other like that. And to then include it in the book, include it in the book. You don't need to have more or less weight on what that photograph does or is functionally to you, compared with what it functionally does to the book. If you include it on the front cover and then include it in the book, no, people aren't going to be tired because they've seen it twice. That's not how it works. Otherwise, everyone would have deleted Instagram, because we've all seen it before. That's not if it's specifically a book and you're looking at it objectively, include whatever needs to be included. If that needs to be the front cover and it also fulfills a function within the confines of the book, do that. I haven't produced many books. I've done some practice zines, but I've read a library of probably too many photo books of other people's, which means I'm overly critical. So maybe that's the wrong way to look at it, but those are my opinions.
Thank you. Where was that question? Do you ever create the images in your photo essay with physical prints?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Do you ever create the images in your photo essays with physical prints?
Absolutely. I very rarely do things the way I've done them in Lightroom now. This was just the simplest way I could think of to demonstrate these ideas to an audience. I have lots and lots of 6x4 prints which I arrange in different ways. If you go onto my onto the recordings of my previous webinars, you'll actually see my walls are normally covered in them, but I'm in the process of moving house, so those are all, you know, sadly gone now. But I do have many prints. I can look at them in sequence, and then sometimes I'll put them up on my wall and I'll realize actually that doesn't look good with that. I'll move it over here, and then patterns will start to emerge. So yeah, printing can be a very useful way to do this, and probably the way I would recommend overdoing it digitally. But again, for the function of this webinar, it's the best way to illustrate.
Great, thank you. Do you consider an establishing photo as the first bookend image?
It can be. It can be because it depends what it establishes. If it establishes the place, then it will work in context with what's about to happen in that place. If it establishes a person, it'll work in context with what's happening with that person. But if you've got a collection of essays and they all need different things established at different times, then that shot will establish will fulfill different roles. Essentially, think about the function first. Think about the function of what's happening in context with everything else, and then you'll know whether an image makes sense for that.
Great, thank you. And a question from Ben: how important is the title? Should it explain the work, or can it be more poetic and leave the viewer with something to figure out?
That's still down to what you want it to be. I think that if you're explaining the work in a caption, then the work hasn't spoken for itself. Which means that if I do include a caption, it's either for journalistic reasons to explain the context of a character, of a situation, of a place, of, you know, to establish context, but it doesn't give away. I don't describe what's happening in my images because the image describes what's happening in the image. And then if you want a caption to be more poetic, then I think you should take it all the way. And, you know, you can present a body of work with a series of poems, or you know, some other article of art that gives you a little bit of balance to that work, that gives you a way to think about. I've often, when I do photo book recommendations, which isn't very often, but I say read this book but also listen to this album at the same time, because that can put you in a mindset. And I also, depending on how long it takes you to absorb images, depending on what song you hit to, that an album could give you completely different set of songs than the ones I heard, so it could be meaningless. But yeah, if you're going to provide a title, if you're going to provide a caption, think about what it's actually doing, whether it's necessary, and whether you've taken it far enough. If you decide, yes, this image works really well, but it needs to have this 3-page poem with it, do that.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm just I think we've answered those ones, really. One quick question, as always: what camera and lens do you use, if you want to share that?
Sure. The majority of my work to date has been on a Leica M6 with a 90mm lens. The 90mm that I have are the f4 compact, like the one that was released with the CL film camera, and the Apo, which is a more kind of digitally based lens. I've written a lot. If you Google like my name and M6 or 90mm, you'll get loads and loads of opinion pieces where you know, you can join everyone else slating me in the comments for being a 90mm rangefinder shooter, but that's the lens that works for me.
Great. It wasn't Sol lighter a 90mm mine?
I think 90mm and longer. Yeah, it's a fascinating focal length, because I think if it works, then it means, you know, it means you fit the frame to your lens. But if it doesn't work, it means you're either not close enough or not far enough. There's very little middle ground. You really have to figure out, because I think the best applications for the 90 are either when something is you know, 30 to 40 meters away, or 2 meters. There's very little in between for the style of work I do. Of course, if you're doing a different kind of work, you use whatever lens you feel best fits the scene. And obviously, because I wear glasses, anything lower than a 35mm, I can't see the frame lines anyway, so why would I bother using it? So I only use 50mm upwards.
Perfect, thank you. And maybe just kind of taking Monica's question as a way of wrapping up. Mm-hmm. Is there a way you can go through this, those series, just very quickly one more time, just to and summarize their key elements?
I can. I think I'll have to figure out the first one because I didn't do the. You'll have to just remind me how I'm gonna filter by the
Yeah.
flags. So this is an essay about the subway in Lisbon. You're introduced to the idea of being in a subway setting, which seems pretty universal depending on the subways. So I think that if you're going to enhance an introductory image for this essay, make it something specific, include some context that makes it about Lisbon. You're then brought onto some situations, characters occurring in this setting. You're brought through elements of train life, and then you're brought out of it by a very close image of people. It doesn't need, like, this photograph doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily think about the subway when you think about this photograph. It removes all of that context and just brings you to, some people in an intimate space. Maybe they're pushed together from the crowd, or they're not, they're choosing to be together, whatever it is. That's what this image leaves you on. This is an essay about,
Sorry, just to quickly go back to that subway one.
yeah.
Just one thing, Julian. Yeah, Julian had a comment. He didn't get the criteria to leave outside some of the pictures if they added context. If an essay is an idea, what would be the idea in the subway?
If the photographs I left out, it's not that they don't contribute anything, it's that they don't add anything. All of the core images should add to something, not just continue. So of these middle images, I would probably only include one. The only reason I included them is because I flagged them and couldn't figure out how to unflag them, but they do make sense in sequence. They don't necessarily, this photograph doesn't add to this photograph, but as a collection of what each of these images would add to this photograph, it does add. You can obviously include all of the images later on, but once you have the images that establish and then contribute, when you have 5 images that contribute the same thing, you only need one of those images. So I would leave out 4 of them. And if they're all equally good, then it wouldn't matter. I would just go, okay, this is the one image for now for me to think about, and then I'll include the rest of them later, which I think would be the case here. Like these they don't like, maybe this could contribute something different in that it's saying something different to this image, which is saying something different to this image. But in terms of what they're adding to the idea of being on a subway or being in a subway, maybe if we had an image of, like, this image and this image are different to each other because this is about, compression and crowding and hands, and this is about, proximity, which feels more consensual, whereas this is about, being hemmed in. These are 2 different ideas, which is why they both justify their place. Whether this idea about being hemmed in and this idea about being hemmed in are different is for the artist to decide. I hope that answers your question.
Sure, thank you.
Cool. This photo essay is about the nightlife in New Orleans. The focus is on the people, the vibrancy, the setting, and especially the music. So this image and this image, they basically do the same thing, just in different ways. The only reason I've included them again here is because time constraints. But if I really had to reduce down, it would just be a matter of which of these says the idea better. I would say it's this one, which means you don't need that, you don't need that. So then it just becomes this. Okay. This one I think is probably the clearest in terms of the presentation. Let's do that. In that it's the idea behind it is about the seasons. So you have each of these 4 images which establishes the season, and then you've got each of these images here which respond to that season. And then this one is, oh, I didn't do it with that one. I think this one I spoke more about what was lacking and presented only the first 3 as the essay. So this photograph, and this photograph, about vanishing, about this situation, this location, which is gradually vanishing. I said that I would probably change the introductory image to something that was a little bit more ghostly and really emphasize that aesthetic. You've got this where these people are clinging on. It's that idea that these aren't the musicians, these are just the patrons of the place. And then you've got this, which is, you can read this as waving goodbye, waving hello, this interaction between the patrons and the musician. These are the 3 images that that best introduce you to this idea, to this place, follow you through with some context about what the emotions of this place within the context of it being a vanishing place mean, and then leave you with something to think about, or leave you with something positive.
Yeah,
Hopefully that's a good enough summary.
Fantastic summary. Yeah, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much, Simon. I mean, I think you've basically just expertly answered almost 40 questions there.
Oh no,
So,
surely not expertly.
yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. And just, I can see there's somebody asking where is there a place where you can watch all the webinars at a later time? I will be, of course, sending a WeTransfer link to download a copy of this recording. I'll also be rewatching it because I feel like I've missed a lot of insightful information there while looking at the questions. So yeah, Leica UK, they have a YouTube channel, and they are, I think, in the process of uploading those webinars there. With regards to other countries, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I know, yeah, Leica US have been doing a big series of workshops there, but I think they also have been posting them on their YouTube channel. So I think just, you know, look up the respective YouTube channel for that country, and I'm sure that's the most likely place they'll be posting them. I think that's it. So yeah, thank you very much again, Simon. Really,
Well,
really
thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it.
interesting. And yeah, email will come out later today. Thank you.